Ever feel like you're drowning in information? Like you're constantly bombarded? I mean, every time you look at your phone, it's buzzing with notifications. There's a million articles online. It's a lot. You want to be informed, of course. You want to understand what's going on, but sometimes it just feels overwhelming.
Yeah, totally. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose, right? That just can't keep up.
Exactly. And that's kind of where we come in with these deep dives. We do the sifting for you, the digging, so you can get right to the heart of things.
Yeah, we try to cut through all the noise and give you those core ideas, those nuggets of wisdom that you can actually apply to your own life.
Exactly. No fluff, just the good stuff. And for this deep dive, we're tackling a pretty fundamental question, one that has resonated across history. How has the concept of spiritual growth, this idea of discipleship, evolved over time? And what can we learn from that evolution? What timeless lessons can we still grab onto today?
And luckily, the sources you provided give us this amazing historical panorama of that very journey, spanning from the early church all the way to the Reformation.
Yeah, it's a wild ride, honestly. I mean, we've got early bishops, maverick monks, medieval practices, and Reformation leaders. It's a whole cast of characters. But through it all, we see how people have grappled with this idea of following Jesus, of growing in their faith.
Absolutely. And the goal today is to really unearth those core elements of discipleship that have persisted throughout history, those principles that remain relevant and applicable even in our modern world. It's about realizing that these ideas have stood the test of time. They've endured for a reason, and they can offer real guidance for anyone today who's seeking a deeper meaning, a more fulfilling way of life.
Okay, so where do we begin?
Well, I guess it makes sense to start at the beginning with the early church. Yeah, let's go back to the basics. After the original apostles, those first followers of Jesus, they died off, leadership kind of shifted to these figures called bishops. They were essentially the overseers, the spiritual leaders in each city. And there's this fascinating guy, Ignatius, who was a really influential writer back then, late first, early second century. He really stressed the importance of unity around a single bishop in each city.
Right. And I guess that emphasis on unity makes sense, especially in those early days when Christians were often persecuted, right? They needed that sense of solidarity.
Oh, absolutely. It was a matter of survival, really. But Ignatius also emphasized the Eucharist as this central unifying act for the church.
The Eucharist.
Yeah, the communal sharing of bread and wine in remembrance of Jesus.
Right, right. Communion. It's interesting, though, when we picture those early church gatherings, it's easy to think of these elaborate ceremonies in grand cathedrals. But back then, things were much simpler.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They were meeting in homes, sharing meals, supporting each other. Those early bishops weren't these distant figures. They were deeply involved in the lives of their communities.
Yeah, very hands-on. They were focused on serving God in their everyday lives, in their families, in their neighborhoods. The text mentions Clement of Rome, who lived at the end of the first century. He wrote this letter to the church in Corinth, and it gives us a glimpse into their understanding of spiritual growth back then.
Right, Clement. And what's interesting about him is that he emphasized prayer, fasting, and almsgiving as essential practices. And for him, it wasn't just about some internal, private piety. He really stressed this idea of relatedness to the real world, caring for others, showing humility.
So it was about putting your faith into action, not just thinking about it.
Exactly. It's about how you live your life, how you treat other people. And that's something that I think still resonates so strongly today, right? It's not enough to just have these beliefs. It's about how those beliefs shape our actions, how we interact with the world around us.
Yeah, that's a good point. But it makes me wonder why they didn't focus as much on things that we often prioritize today, like individual Bible study, for example.
Remember, the Bible as we know it didn't even exist back then. I mean, the New Testament canon, the official list of books, took a couple more centuries to solidify.
Right, so they didn't have their own personal copies to read.
No, not at all. Plus, most people couldn't read anyway.
Yeah.
Literacy was pretty low back then, and without the printing press, books were rare and expensive.
So they experienced their faith primarily through those communal gatherings, through hearing the teachings and participating in the rituals.
Exactly. And the altar, the place where they celebrated the Eucharist, was really central to their spiritual formation. It was a tangible symbol of their unity and their connection to Christ.
Okay, so that gives us a sense of Clement and that emphasis on practical action. But the text also mentions Ignatius of Antioch, who lived a bit later in the early second century, and he was known as the Bishop of Bishops.
Yeah, Ignatius, he was a big deal. He wrote a bunch of letters to different churches, and his writings were really influential in shaping early church leadership.
And what's interesting about him is that he believed a true disciple should be willing to die for their faith. I mean, he was actually martyred, executed for his beliefs.
Yeah, that was a defining mark of discipleship back then. You know, that willingness to face persecution, even death, for your faith. It's a pretty intense level of commitment, right? But his letters weren't just about martyrdom, though. He also wrote extensively about the importance of unity within the Christian community, echoing a lot of the Apostle John's teachings about walking in the light and having fellowship with one another.
So even back then, maintaining unity within the church wasn't always easy.
No, definitely not. They were dealing with all sorts of internal conflicts and disagreements. But Ignatius saw that unity as essential for spiritual growth.
Makes sense. I mean, if you're constantly fighting with each other, it's hard to focus on anything else.
Right, exactly. And what's really striking is that even as Ignatius faced death, he wrote with this incredible humility. He said that he was still just beginning to be a disciple.
Wow. So even as he was about to die for his faith, he still saw himself as a learner, still on that journey of growth.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important reminder for us today that spiritual growth isn't something we ever truly arrive at, you know? It's a lifelong process.
So study, prayer, service, worship, unity, love. Those are the key emphases.
Yeah, those are the core elements. And Ignatius also stressed something that might sound a bit different to our modern ears, the importance of submitting to the authority of church leaders.
Oh, interesting. I mean, we hear a lot these days about questioning authority, right?
Right, but for Ignatius, that respect for leadership was actually seen as foundational for spiritual development. He believed that God worked through those ordained leaders to guide and shape his people.
That's a perspective that's worth pondering for sure. Okay, so we've got Clement and his emphasis on practical action. We've got Ignatius and his focus on unity and submission to authority. Who's next in this lineup of early church leaders?
Well, the text highlights Polycarp of Smyrna, who was a disciple of the Apostle John. And like Ignatius, he was also martyred around 156 AD. And like Ignatius, he also believed that a true disciple should be willing to imitate Christ, even in suffering. But Polycarp also had this strong emphasis on showing practical love, especially towards the poor. He was very critical of those who just intellectualized their faith without actually living it out in tangible ways.
So for him, it wasn't enough to just talk the talk. You had to walk the walk.
Exactly. And that idea of caring for the poor, of demonstrating your faith through concrete actions, that's a theme that runs throughout early Christianity.
Makes sense. Jesus himself spent a lot of time with the outcasts and the marginalized, right? He challenged his followers to do the same.
Exactly. And Polycarp took that challenge seriously.
Yeah.
And in his letter to the Philippians, he gives all this practical advice on how to navigate the challenges of everyday life as a Christian. He talks about temptation, about marriage, about dealing with false teaching. He emphasizes the importance of scripture reading, prayer, and self-control.
So very practical guidance. And all of this was rooted in his personal connection to the apostles, right? He learned directly from those who had walked with Jesus.
Yeah, he had that direct lineage, that firsthand knowledge. And he saw his role as passing on those teachings to the next generation to help them live out their faith authentically. And another key theme that emerges from Polycarp, and it's something we've seen with the other early leaders as well, is this emphasis on community, on the importance of being part of a supportive group of believers.
Right, that idea that we need each other to grow, to stay strong in our faith.
Exactly. He understood that it takes a community to help someone resist temptation, to encourage them when they're struggling, to hold them accountable to their commitments. It's not something we can do on our own.
So when we look at these early church figures together, what are the key actionable takeaways for us today?
Well, I think a few things really stand out. First, there's this emphasis on simplicity and real-world application. Their faith wasn't about elaborate rituals or complex doctrines. It was about living out those core values of love, service, and humility in their everyday lives. They were deeply connected to their communities, and they saw their faith as something that should transform every aspect of their existence.
Right, it wasn't compartmentalized. And they were willing to sacrifice, to face real hardship, even death, for their beliefs.
Absolutely. And there's also this strong emphasis on the role of church leadership. They saw their leaders as spiritual guides, as people who had the authority to interpret Scripture and offer direction.
Which is an interesting contrast to our current cultural climate, right? Where questioning authority is often seen as a virtue.
Right, exactly. But for those early Christians, that submission to leadership was seen as essential for growth. And finally, there's that constant theme of community. They understood that we need each other to grow, to stay grounded, to persevere in our faith.
So a focus on practical action, a respect for leadership, and a deep commitment to community. Those seem to be the core elements that emerge from the early church. Okay, so that gives us a good foundation. But as the text notes, things start to shift and evolve over time.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, fast forward a few centuries, and Christianity is no longer this persecuted minority religion. It becomes legal than the official religion of the Roman Empire. And with that shift in status, we see the church becoming more institutionalized, more hierarchical. And that's where we start to see the emergence of the papacy, with the Bishop of Rome gradually becoming the leading figure in the church, the Pope.
And while the idea of a unified Catholic Church, remember, Catholic originally just meant universal, sounds good in theory, the text doesn't shy away from some of the problems that emerged, particularly in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, we start to see instances of corruption within the papacy, where popes are more concerned with political power and worldly wealth than with their spiritual responsibilities.
And that's really the backdrop for the emergence of the monastic movement, right?
Exactly. Those early monks were reacting to what they saw as a growing complacency, a spiritual lukewarmness within the church. They felt that the church had become too comfortable, too worldly. So they intentionally withdrew from mainstream society to pursue a more radical, more authentic expression of their faith.
It's interesting because when we think of monks, we often picture them as passive, as just retreating from the world, but the text actually portrays them as these mavericks, these
Yeah,
innovators.
they were definitely pushing boundaries,
Yeah.
challenging the status quo. And one of the key figures in this movement was St. Anthony the Hermit, who lived in the 3rd and 4th centuries. He's considered the first known monk. He sold all his possessions and went out into the Egyptian desert to seek God in solitude.
Wow, that's a pretty radical move.
It was. And he wasn't just running away from the world, he was intentionally choosing a life of poverty and simplicity, of intense prayer and self-discipline.
So he was trying to strip away all the distractions, all the trappings of worldly success to really focus on his relationship with God.
Exactly. And his example inspired others to do the same. Soon, there were all these hermits living in caves and deserts throughout Egypt and Syria, seeking a more direct, more intense experience of God.
And eventually, that solitary hermit life evolved into these monastic communities, right?
Yeah, that's right. As more and more people were drawn to this way of life, they started forming these communities, often in remote locations, where they could live together and support each other in their spiritual pursuits. And these communities developed their own rules and structures, their own ways of life.
And they were led by abbots, right?
Yeah, the abbot was like the spiritual father of the community. He provided guidance, instruction, and discipline. And by the 5th century, the monastic movement was so influential that even many bishops were chosen from among the monks.
Wow, so they really had a significant impact on the church as a whole. But what was it about this monastic way of life that was so appealing?
Well, I think it was a combination of factors. For some, it was the attraction of a simpler life, free from the distractions and temptations of the world. For others, it was the desire for a deeper spiritual experience, for a closer connection with God. And for many, it was the appeal of community, of being part of a supportive group of people who shared their values and aspirations.
So it was a kind of countercultural movement, a rejection of the materialism and superficiality of mainstream society.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And I think
Yeah.
there's something about that countercultural impulse that still resonates with people today.
Hmm.
We see it in the growing interest in minimalism, in intentional living, in simpler forms of spirituality.
Right. It's like this yearning for something more authentic, more meaningful than what consumer culture offers.
Exactly. And the monastic movement offers some valuable insights into how we might pursue that deeper way of life. And as the text points out, it's important to remember that these monks weren't just passive recluses. They were often deeply engaged in the world around them, through acts of service, through scholarship, through their involvement in social and political issues.
So they weren't just retreating from the world, they were engaging with it in a different way.
Exactly. And that's something I think we can learn from them today. It's not about withdrawing from society entirely. It's about finding ways to live out our faith in the midst of it all, to be a transformative presence in the world. And I love that quote from Bonhoeffer, where he talks about the need for a new monasticism which will be nothing like the old. That really challenges us to think creatively about how we can apply those core monastic values: humility, service, simplicity, community in our own context.
Yeah, that's a great quote. So, what are some of those core qualities that we could perhaps recapture from the monastic tradition and integrate into our lives today?
Well, the text highlights a few key ones. Humility, obviously, is huge. It's about recognizing our own limitations,
Hmm.
our need for God's grace. Then there's that willingness to sacrifice, to put the needs of others before our own. And there's that commitment to living by a rule, a set of guidelines that helps us stay focused on what really matters.
Right. And there's that emphasis on mutual accountability, on being part of a community that can support us and challenge us in our spiritual growth.
Exactly. And of course, there's a practice of spiritual disciplines, things like prayer, fasting, meditation. Silence those practices that help us connect with God on a deeper level, to cultivate a more mindful and intentional way of life.
So it's not just about thinking about God, it's about actively pursuing a relationship with Him through these intentional practices.
Exactly. It's about cultivating those habits that shape our hearts and minds, that help us become more like Christ. And the monastic tradition offers a rich tapestry of practices that we can draw from. Now, the text dives into three key monastic orders: the Benedictines, the Franciscans, and the Dominicans, each with their own unique emphasis and contribution.
Okay, so let's unpack those a bit. Let's start with Benedict and the Benedictines.
Okay, so Benedict lived in the 6th century, and he's best known for his rule, which became the foundation for monastic life in Western Europe for centuries. And what's really insightful about the Benedictine approach is their emphasis on balance. They believe in this daily rhythm of work, prayer, and study.
So it's about integrating your faith into every aspect of your life. It's not just something you do on Sundays or in your private devotions.
Exactly. And they believe in finding God in the ordinary, in the everyday routines of life, through manual labor, through contemplative reading, through regular prayer. It's not about some mystical, otherworldly experience. It's about cultivating a deep awareness of God's presence in the midst of the mundane.
That's really appealing, that idea of finding sacredness in the everyday.
Yeah, and it's a challenge, right? I mean, we live in a world that's constantly bombarding us with distractions. But the Benedictines remind us that God is present in those quiet moments, in the simple tasks, in the relationships that make up our lives.
It's about paying attention, about being present to the moment.
Exactly. And that's a discipline. It takes practice. But I think it's a practice that can bring a lot of peace and meaning to our lives.
Okay, so the Benedictines are all about balance and finding God in the ordinary. What about the Franciscans? What sets them apart?
Well, the Franciscans are known for their radical commitment to poverty and their deep love for creation. Their founder, Francis of Assisi, was this wealthy merchant's son who gave up everything to follow Christ in a life of simplicity and service. He was literally known to preach to the birds.
Wow, so they took Jesus's teachings about poverty very seriously.
They did. And while we might not be called to embrace literal poverty in the same way, I think their example challenges us to examine our own relationship with material possessions, to ask ourselves how much we really need, how attached we are to comfort and security.
Right, it's about detaching ourselves from those worldly things that can so easily distract us from what really matters.
Exactly. And for Francis, that detachment was all about imitating Christ. He wanted to live as Jesus lived, to experience the world as Jesus experienced it.
And that included a deep love for nature, right?
Oh, absolutely. Francis saw God's presence everywhere, in every creature, in every blade of grass. He believed that creation was a reflection of God's glory, and he treated all living things with reverence and respect.
That's beautiful. And it's something we could use a lot more of today, I think. With all the environmental challenges we're facing, we need that Franciscan perspective, that sense of interconnectedness with all of creation.
Definitely. And the third order the text explores is the Dominicans, who were founded by St. Dominic in the 13th century. And they're known for their emphasis on preaching and teaching, on intellectual rigor and engagement with the world.
So they were more academic, more focused on spreading the message through scholarship and reasoned argument.
Yeah, they were. Dominic himself was a highly educated man, and he saw the importance of equipping others to defend the faith against heresy and to articulate the truth of the gospel in a compelling way.
So they were like the apologists of their day.
Yeah, kind of. And they founded universities, wrote books, and engaged in public debates to try to win people over to the Christian faith.
And that's still relevant today, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we live in a world where ideas are constantly being challenged and debated.
Absolutely. We need to be able to articulate our faith intelligently and thoughtfully, to engage with those who have different perspectives, to defend the truth in a way that's both compelling and respectful.
And the Dominicans provide a great model for that kind of intellectual engagement. Okay, so we've got the Benedictines with their emphasis on balance, the Franciscans with their radical poverty and love for creation, and the Dominicans with their focus on intellectual rigor. It's amazing how these different monastic orders each contributed to a richer, more nuanced understanding of what it means to follow Christ.
Yeah, they really do. And it shows that There's no one-size-fits-all approach to discipleship. There are different paths, different expressions of faith, but what unites all these orders is their deep commitment to living out the gospel, to embodying the teachings of Jesus in their lives.
Right. It's about that core commitment, that fundamental transformation of heart and mind. Okay, so that brings us to the Middle Ages.
Hmm.
What can we learn about discipleship from that era?
Now, this period is often seen as the Dark Ages, a
Mm.
time of ignorance and superstition. But it's actually a lot more complex than that. And for the average person living in the Middle Ages, their spiritual formation was shaped primarily by three key influences: the Eucharist, communal worship, and art.
Okay, so let's unpack those a bit, starting with the Eucharist.
Yeah, so back then, the Eucharist, or Holy Communion, was the central act of Christian worship. It was a powerful symbol of unity, of Christ's sacrifice, and of the shared life of the church. And it was something that everyone participated in, regardless of their social status or level of education.
Right. And it was rooted in those earliest church traditions in the Last Supper and the Jewish Passover.
Exactly. And it served as this regular rhythm in their lives, this constant reminder of God's presence and grace. It was a source of comfort and strength in the midst of all the challenges they faced.
And then there's communal worship.
Yeah, so life in the Middle Ages was very communal. People lived and worked in close proximity to each other, so worship was naturally a shared experience. They would gather together to hear scripture read, to sing hymns, to pray, to be encouraged by their leaders.
Right. So it wasn't about this individualized private faith. It was about being part of a community of believers.
Exactly. And even what we might think of as personal devotions were often rooted in those communal experiences. People would memorize scripture passages, they would reflect on the sermons they had heard, they would pray together in their homes.
So their spiritual formation was very much shaped by that communal context.
It was. And I think there's something we can learn from that today. I mean, we live in a culture that emphasizes individuality, self-reliance, but the truth is we need each other. We need that support, that encouragement, that accountability that comes from being part of a community of faith.
That makes sense. Okay. And then there's the influence of art.
Yeah, so art played a huge role in the Middle Ages, especially because most people couldn't read. They would learn about the Bible and the teachings of the church through paintings, sculptures, stained glass windows. It was a very visual culture.
Right. It's like those giant murals in the Sistine Chapel.
Exactly. And those images were meant to inspire awe and wonder, to evoke a sense of the divine. They were a way of communicating spiritual truths to people who might not have been able to access them through written texts.
And it's interesting because even today, we're still drawn to art. I mean, people travel from all over the world to see those masterpieces. And those images still have the power to move us, to inspire us, to connect us to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the challenge for us today is to be more intentional about the kind of art we're consuming. I mean, we're bombarded with images all the time, but so much of it is superficial, consumerist, even harmful. So it's important to seek out art that nourishes our souls, that connects us to truth and beauty, that reminds us of God's presence in the world.
So it's about being more discerning, more critical about the images we allow into our lives.
Exactly. And that's a discipline. It takes effort, but it's worth it because art has this incredible power to shape our hearts and minds.
Okay, so the Middle Ages, Eucharist, communal worship, art. Three powerful influences that shaped the spiritual lives of those who lived in that era. And it's fascinating to see how those influences still resonate with us today.
They do. And now we come to the Reformation, which was a period of massive upheaval and change within the church.
And one of the key factors in that upheaval was the invention of the printing press, right?
Yeah, the printing press was huge. It completely revolutionized the way information was spread, and it allowed for the rapid dissemination of new ideas, including religious ideas.
And it was Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which were printed and distributed widely, that really sparked the Reformation.
Right, and those theses were a direct challenge to some of the practices and doctrines of the Catholic Church, particularly the selling of indulgences, which Luther saw as a form of spiritual corruption.
And it's important to remember the historical context here. People were living with this intense fear of damnation, of spending eternity in purgatory, and the church was offering these indulgences as a way to reduce that time.
Yeah, it was a pretty lucrative system for the church.
Yeah.
But Luther saw it as a distortion of the gospel. He believed that salvation was a free gift from God, received through faith in Jesus Christ, not something you could buy or earn.
And that message resonated with a lot of people, right? It was incredibly liberating.
It was. And it led to this massive movement that swept across Europe, splitting the church and leading to the formation of Protestant denominations.
And the printing press played a key role in that
Yeah.
movement, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It allowed for the rapid spread of Luther's ideas, of his translation of the Bible into German, of all sorts of pamphlets and treatises that challenged the authority of the church. It was like this information explosion.
Wow. So the Reformation was really fueled by this new technology, and it led to some significant changes in the way people understood and practiced their faith, right?
It did. I mean, it shifted the focus from the rituals and sacraments of the church to the individual's personal relationship with God, to the authority of Scripture, to the priesthood of all believers. It was a major paradigm shift.
And the text highlights a number of key Reformation figures and their unique contributions to our understanding of discipleship.
Yeah, and I think it's important to explore those figures because they each offer valuable insights into how we can live out our faith authentically in our own time. So where do you want to start?
Let's start with Luther himself. He seems like the logical starting point.
Okay, so Luther is a fascinating character. He was this Augustinian monk, He was deeply devout, deeply committed to the church. But he also had this incredible intellectual curiosity, this willingness to question authority, even the authority of the Pope.
And that got him into some serious trouble, right?
It did. I mean, he was excommunicated from the church, declared a heretic, and he had to go into hiding for a while to avoid being arrested.
Wow, so he was really putting his life on the line for his beliefs.
He was. And what's so inspiring about Luther is his courage, his unwavering commitment to what he believed was true. He wasn't afraid to stand up to the most powerful institution in the world, even if it meant risking everything.
And that takes guts.
It does. And I think that's a quality we need more of today. That willingness to speak truth to power, to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's unpopular or uncomfortable.
Right. And Luther's example shows that sometimes those acts of courage can have ripple effects that we can't even imagine.
Absolutely. I mean, he set in motion this whole chain of events that changed the course of history. And his emphasis on the authority of Scripture, on the priesthood of all believers, on the centrality of grace, those are ideas that still resonate with us today.
Yeah, they're foundational principles for many Christian denominations.
They are. And they're ideas that have the power to transform lives.
Okay, so Luther is all about courage and challenging the status quo. What about John Calvin? What's his contribution to this conversation about discipleship?
Well, Calvin was a brilliant theologian and a gifted organizer. He took Luther's ideas and systematized them, developing this comprehensive theological framework that became known as Calvinism.
And he was based in Geneva, right?
Yeah, he fled to Geneva to escape persecution in France.
Yeah.
And he ended up transforming the city into this kind of model Protestant community. He was very influential in shaping the laws and the social structures of Geneva based on his understanding of biblical principles.
So he was very much about putting his faith into practice, about living out his beliefs in a tangible way.
He was. And one of his key emphases was the idea of union with Christ, this idea that we're not just saved by Christ, but we're actually united with him, brought into this deep, intimate relationship with him.
And that union with Christ has practical implications, right? It shapes how we live our lives.
Exactly. And for Calvin, that meant living a life of holiness, of obedience to God's law, of serving others, of pursuing justice. He believed that our faith should be reflected in every aspect of our lives.
So very much a holistic approach to discipleship.
Very much so. And he also emphasized the importance of discipline, of self-control, of living a life that's ordered and purposeful.
Okay, so courage, a systematic theology, and a focus on living out our faith in a tangible way. Those are some of the key takeaways from Calvin.
Yes, and he wrote extensively too. His Institutes of the Christian Religion is a foundational text for Reformed theology. It's not light reading, but it's worth checking out if you're interested in diving deeper into his ideas.
Okay, I'll add it to my reading list. So who's next?
Well, the text mentions Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury during the English Reformation.
Oh, right. So he was instrumental in separating the Church of England from the Catholic Church.
Yeah, he was. And he's best known for his work on the Book of Common Prayer, which is still used by Anglicans today.
Right. And that book was significant because it provided a structured guide for daily devotion, a way for people to engage with Scripture and prayer on a regular basis.
Exactly. And it was written in English, which was revolutionary at the time. It meant that ordinary people who couldn't read Latin could now access the Bible and participate in worship in their own language.
So it really democratized faith in a sense.
It did. And it provided a framework for personal discipleship that was accessible to everyone.
Okay, so Cranmer gave us the Book of Common Prayer. Who else do we have?
Well, the text highlights Philip Jacob Spener, who was a German Lutheran pastor in the 17th century.
And he was a key figure in the Pietist movement, right?
Yeah, he was. And Pietism was all about emphasizing the personal experiential dimension of faith. They were concerned that the Lutheran Church had become too intellectual, too focused on doctrine, and they wanted to bring back a sense of warmth and passion.
So they were all about the heart, about that deep emotional connection with God.
Exactly. And Spener was a big advocate for small group meetings, where people could study the Bible together, pray for each other, and encourage each other in their faith.
Right, that idea of mutual accountability and support that we've seen in earlier eras.
Exactly. And they also emphasized the importance of living out their faith in tangible ways, through acts of service, through social reform, through evangelism.
So it was about connecting your faith to your actions, to your everyday life.
Very much so. And that's a theme that runs throughout the history of discipleship, right? It's not just about what we believe, it's about how those beliefs shake our actions, how they transform our lives.
Okay, so Spener and the Pietists brought back a focus on the heart, on the emotional dimension of faith. Who's next in this lineup?
Well, the text then introduces Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, who was a German nobleman in the 18th century, and he was a key figure in the Moravian movement, which was another offshoot of Pietism.
And the Moravians were known for their missionary zeal, right?
Yeah, they were incredibly passionate about spreading the gospel to the world. And Zinzendorf was a driving force behind that missionary effort. He actually sent out more missionaries than any other Protestant leader of his time.
Wow, so he really took the Great Commission seriously.
He did. And he believed that the key to effective missions was unity, that Christians needed to work together across denominational lines to share the love of Christ with the world.
So he was ahead of his time in that sense.